Welcome to the Friday solo of the Redacted Culture podcast. Redacted Culture Codcast. We got to come up with a new name. Today's subject is the philosophy of violence. It's a long-standing, long-wanted subject that I have been studying on and considering for the greater part of 10 years. So this is the first foray into a long connected series on what we call violence and the philosophy of violence. So thank you for listening in. If you have been listening to the show for a while, you know Fridays are solo events. We don't have guests on, and they are driven by topics a little bit more topically than it is on people. So, as Robert Nozick stated in Anarchy, State, and Utopia, the first question of political philosophy or philosophy of government is to ask the question of why government at all. The first question when it comes to the concept of violence would be, what is violence and how do we differentiate it from other things? In the, what would you consider, not the Stanford, but the Oxford Companion to Philosophy, there isn't even a term for violence alone, but in the text regarding political violence, you can find a substantial argument in the differentiation between what you'd consider violence and force to be whether one is lawful, which on a statement of reality, going back to metaphysics, comes into question. Before we dive deeper into the question of what is violence, we need to establish some ground rules. Those ground rules, for those who have spent years in philosophical conversation, will be less new, but to those who are more adjacent to those subjects, this will be how we establish our preconceived assumptions. The first one will be, we want to retain to the foundations of philosophy in regards to ethics, metaphysics, epistemology, and logic. Those are the four subjects of philosophy, the four core pillars of philosophy that we'll be engaging with. One, metaphysics. What is reality? What is the foundations of and laws of reality? An example of a metaphysical question would be, what is gravity? What is the law of gravity, more specifically? The second one would be ethics. What is good? What is it that makes a thing good? What is morality? How do we determine morality? How do we understand morality? This is obviously going to have a heavy play in regards to the philosophy of violence, because violence in its effect can almost never be separated from moral evaluation. Third one is epistemology. And this one will come into play in two factors. One factor will be, how do we understand a thing to be known, or how is a concept of violence known and understood? And the second one will actually breach into a little bit more of a contemporary issue of information knowledge or information warfare and violence, and how we could use or even engage with concepts and ideas like speech is violence and ideas are violence. The fourth one will be logic. Logic in the realm of professional philosophy is not necessarily the strength of an argument, but its cogency. An argument that can exist within, or something to distinguish within the use of logic within these podcasts regarding the philosophy of violence would be that when I say a thing is logical, it means that it doesn't have any inherent contradictions that I have perceived. That is not to say that it is a forceful argument. So when a thing adheres to the rules of logic, what I'm arguing is that it doesn't contradict itself. Therefore, recovering these four subjects: metaphysics, what is reality? What is violence? Ethics, what is the moral framework within that violence exists? Epistemology, how is it that we know a thing is violent? How do we understand knowledge? And then how is knowledge related to violence? And four, logic, which is an overarching framework that I can say a subject is not inherently contradicting. For example, we could make an argument that certain forms, for example, in regards to logic, I would say that it is logically inconsistent that one form of one person doing a thing is violent and another person doing it is not violent. Maybe that would say is logically inconsistent because we separate the action from the individual, and so that the action itself is violent, and what we're really making we can separate the action from the individual, and that a thing cannot be violent and not violent at the same time. Therefore, the evaluation that one person doing the thing and another person doing the thing is or isn't violent would be a contradiction, because, well, we've defined that the action is violent, and then violence being, evaluated one way or another, a thing being violent, not being evaluated as moral in both categories is different. I need to clarify that, and I will in a future conversation. So let's start with the question, which most philosophy engages in most philosophy has to deal with first, is what is the thing that we're engaging with. Let's start with what is violence. This is where it's going to be tricky. Most of the information, colloquially or commonly described as regarding to violence, is actually driven more by motivation than by fact. So we can ask the question, what is violence? We can say it is doing physical harm to another person. Well, we can run aground a little bit right there, because in essence, a doctor will cut a body in surgery, which will cause damage to the cells in order to provide, let's just say, healing to the whole. I'm not going to get into the details yet on, whether or not surgery and removing a tumor and all these other things are concerned. What we're starting with is that simply causing physical harm is not a sufficient definition for violence. What are the things that are usually involved in when a thing is considered violence? We can say violence will be an interaction between two persons, or two, well, is it even persons? Because now we want to involve animals. Does a lion act violently towards a zebra? There's a question that we want to be answering. And so when it comes to the metaphysics of violence, we need to answer these questions. What is it? What is it not? What are its limitations? Let's start with violence. We generally consider violence to be an interaction between two living creatures that cause harm. Unless we're going to go into the colloquial uses of, like, he was violently beating the hammer on the door, or he was whatever. So inherently, the language of violence is charged with morality. Therefore, we need to try to do what we can to separate the is from the ought in this description. I think a successful definition of violence is the use of force between conscious persons. I think that's, it's a difficult subject, but I think one example of violence is the use of force between entities. Now, this differs from the Oxford definition because it requires lawlessness outside of the law or against the law in order for a thing to be considered force or violence. Why do I hold this position? Because I don't think that the law has authority over metaphysics. I don't think that legal systems have authority over metaphysics in that argument. I think that the existence of a thing, violence, can preclude and pre-exist any sort of legal system. It has a more foundational, closer to reality or closer to origin connection to existence than the abstract, which is a legal system. Let's go back to violence again. Is violence a physical or an abstract thing? I think it fundamentally is an abstract thing with a physical consequence. So the act of doing violence is different than the concept of violence is different than thinking about violence. And so when we get down to violence as a concept because I'm sure if this is on YouTube and there's like some auto texting, it's going to be like, he said the word violence 700 times. Like, well, it's a subject and it's a delving into a difficult topic. Pause for beverage. So when we engage in the question of what is violence, we have to start by abstracting the ethics. And I will make a second claim. Violence itself is amoral. Violence is the causing of damage or the harm, which again, you can get into the definitions of harm, of an otherwise functioning organic being, or let's just say, so violence is the invasive use of force on an organic being to otherwise alter their trajectory in living. That's another. We're starting to get a little bit more narrow, which means so one element that's necessary for a thing to be violent is it needs to have physicality to it. It needs to have physicality to it. Just because a really good example would be shooting somebody versus hacking their bank account and draining their bank account, or cyber warfare versus physical warfare. A thing can become violent in a sense when I am using physical force to alter the whatever it is that constitutes the body of another being in order to produce, like whether or not it's in order to produce an outcome is, I think, a little bit less relevant. I think if we can take the concept of violence and boil it down into an action, then we can make moral evaluations of the application of that action. Instead of dividing it necessarily between ethical structures, we start with what it is. So, the is of violence is the use of force, perhaps even invasive force, to alter the condition of another organic being. This is where that will be easy to answer is a bar fight. It doesn't become violence until someone punches somebody else. Otherwise, it's just yelling, maybe shoving. I guess you could run into the gray area of shoving, where a definition of this sort, the use of physical force to produce invasive change on another organic being becomes difficult, is what happens when if I shut down your power grid. And you could then be forced to make the argument that a collection of organic beings, let's just say a city, state, nation, can also be, violence can be done on a nation by the collective impact on its people. But then we start getting into really, really, really gray areas. The point in this delving into the metaphysics of violence, which I apologize for its confusion because it's a difficult subject, is that the foundational thing that needs to be separated is that we have to be able to separate the action of what it is from the moral evaluation. The reason why I make this argument is because there are a series of commonly used phrases or commonly held beliefs that I think in general are terrible and extremely oversimplified. One of them being violence is a necessary evil. If violence is a necessary evil, people who believe in, let's just say, the Bible will have issues, because there are times in the Old Testament where God commands people to do evil. God commands people to do violence. So, and necessary in a modal term means it is this way in all, it is evaluated as evil in all possible worlds and all possible events. The claim that violence is necessarily evil is either an excuse to sound smart, sorry you're not, or maybe you are, just come on dude, or it's a modal claim on the metaphysical necessity of evil to be evaluated as morally, the modal necessity of violence to be morally evaluated as evil. That means in all possible worlds, any form of violence is always evil. In a theistic, specifically Christian worldview, this is not possible. It breaks a logical necessity. God is the author in a Christian theistic worldview. God is the author of good. Therefore, what God calls and commands is therefore good. God is the source of goodness. He is not evaluated by a system of goodness. He is the source of goodness. In other words, when man were to make evaluations of God, they would be failing because they're not capable of doing it, and they would be acting against the proper order of reality. This is why, in a sense, God condemns people, or there is condemnation within the Bible that argues against people making moral evaluations of God. We can try to understand it, but it's not the same thing. So if goodness flows out of God as the necessary product of his creative being, and God makes a commandment to people to do violence, God then is telling people to do a violent thing, and it cannot be considered evil. What about then within a naturalistic worldview? How does this play out if you take God out of the picture? Well, there are some extremely difficult hurdles that have to be jumped. One of them is, where does moral evaluation come from in general? If you don't have an author of good, where does goodness come from? That is a very long-standing moral question. But one thing that can be concluded then is that if you start from a naturalistic worldview, you can either safely begin with violence being an amoral activity. It is something that simply happens between organic things, and then you can separate the fact of a thing being violent from the moral evaluation of it being good or bad, or you can do that. You can come to this conclusion by understanding that the method by which morality is evaluated comes into question outside of reality itself. I guess you could make that argument. You could also make another argument that it's weird because I don't really think I really have a hard time arguing for naturalists. I think that the biggest challenge of a naturalistic worldview is simply that you have no way to order morality other than something that's extremely arbitrary, not arbitrary, extremely ambiguous, like human flourishing or whatever that is. And then you have no judge by which it's to be evaluated. And then it just it becomes difficult. Is it respectful? I respect it, but I think it's very difficult. I think moral skepticism is more likely. But back to the topic on hand. Let's start with our four categories again: metaphysics, ethics, epistemology, and logic. Logic is we're not building a case for logic. We're just using that as an evaluative subject. So, metaphysics: what is violence? Use of force between organic beings. Let's just start with that. Use of force between organic beings. So, ethics: there is a framework by which more violence is evaluated, and it's not absolutes. So, if violence is necessarily evil, I think that's a cheapening answer, because I think we can come to some conclusions that the ethics of a violent encounter are determined by the context by which that violence is engaged in. There's a difference between defending one's life and attacking another. We know this. Or no, we not know this. We have this codified in the law in most places. And if you work for a court system and you don't believe in the right to self-defense, then please stop practicing law. But please stop practicing law if you don't think people have a right to self-defense. That's it, but we're digressing. So now we have separations. We are separating two acts of violence. Let's just say we have an engagement where two people commit violence in identical ways. They shoot another person with a gun, whatever. We evaluate whether or not that action was right or wrong based on the context and the decisions involved. So one of the contexts might be the intent of the shooter. Was the intent of the shooter to cause harm? Was the intent of the shooter to defend their own life? Was the intent was the shooter in their own home? Was the shooter in somebody else's home? Were they the aggressor? Were they not the aggressor? Were they reacting? Were they proactive? Was this a long precluded thought? Was it something that came out of the void? Are they crazy? Are they sane? And so we use a batch of contextual questions by which we evaluate the worthiness of an action. Now, we evaluate the worthiness of an action, which also highlights another metaphysical point. The action of a person and the evaluation of the action of a person is different than the evaluation of a person. So I can say that person did an evil act. I can say the act is evil. I can also say that evil person acted. Different components. We're making moral evaluations of things. And what we find out when we study and we spend time in the philosophy of violence is that there's a lot of moral weight to it. And that shouldn't come as a surprise, but it is always a disservice to oversimplify the subject of violence. Here's another, and so it is always dangerous, if not a disservice, to simplify the subject of violence. And so how do we then understand it? Well, part of the answer is reading. And reading and studying and looking and evaluating the components of violence. Why is violence such an important subject? Because it itself can be used, and the abstraction of it can be used. The threat of violence is not. There is the act of violence. And there's the threat of violence, and I think the ultimate reason why how we think about it is so important is because of the great weight it carries. In the same way that the great weight of the idea of human rights carries a lot of weight, so does how we understand violence. And how we can understand this portrayed in our culture at all, whether it's within gun culture or Americans as a whole, is that we see we see within our culture many things claimed as rights. It is my right, whether it's my right to my property, or it's a human right to have access to abortion, or whether it's a right, it's a right, it's a right. The concept of a right is a metaphysical claim that bears moral weight. If I possess a right, you are obligated to uphold that right. You are, or at least not offended, depending on how you get into the conversation of positive rights versus negative rights, which, if you're listening at the date of this release, we are going to be getting into that on Wednesday of the following week. Wednesday of next week, this week, let's see, it's actually Wednesday of this week, we have Isaac Botkin coming on the show. He will be going live on the 9th of November. And Isaac Botkin and I start getting into the history of the Enlightenment and how we got to the concept of the Second Amendment, which over time, this subject will be engaging in more and more and more. Now, we can break down certain scenarios, but how we use violence, because violence carries an immense moral weight, it is therefore much more necessary that we understand and we pay attention to how we think about it. Whether or not this is for the right of self-defense, or how we think about self-defense, or how we think about political violence, or how we think about all these concerns, because it is at our doorstep and you'll never get away from it. I hate to break it to you, there is no getting away from this subject. So, we've covered a little bit of engaging in the what versus the we're starting to build the framework here. And if instead of trying to go into full detail on all the subjects, because these Friday podcasts are meant to be a little bit shorter, when we consider the concept of violence, we need to break down what it is, what ought it be, how do we evaluate it, and how do we understand it. The is the ought, and what do we know? I guess, what is knowledge? Now, I think the subject of epistemology has kind of the least weight at this time. But let's start with some examples, because we're going to continue this series. Let's start with some examples that are commonly used. One, what is terrorism versus political violence versus ethnic violence, or all these add-ons that are attached to violence? Most differentiations when it comes to common language on types of violence are determined by the motivation. So, political violence is the use of force outside of political violence is loosely defined or defined within philosophical conversation as the use of force, the use of violence, which is unlawful force, according to that definition. The use of unlawful force in order to produce a political outcome. I don't think this definition is sufficient, because the differentiation between force and violence is not effective. I don't think it has any meaningful distinction. I think force and violence can in many sense be considered synonymous, because the concept of violence precludes the concept of government and legality. There was violence before there was law. Law does not make a thing violent, nor does it turn force into violence or violence into force. Law is whether or not the application of that violence was legal and should be punished under the law. There's a difference between legality and morality. But political violence. What is political violence? It is the use of force, in my definition, is the use of force against people to produce a political outcome. That means one example of violence would be using force to prevent people from voting in a democratic environment. If the political system at bay is, or the political system being used is some form of democracy, where the vote of the population determines the government to produce the idea of a government for the people or by the people, whichever you want to call it, then the use of force to prevent people from voting, to bar people or prevent people from the mechanism of politics, would be considered political violence. That, I think, needs to be distinguished from terrorism. So what would also fall into political violence? Regicide. If you were to, or killing the king, right? King is part of the government organization of a population. To kill that king would be considered a form of political violence. Is it the most necessary element? Maybe not, but hey, whatever. Another form of political violence would be to attack people based on their political view. Use the determining factor of violence being based on a person's political view, which is interesting, because you could think of it on one example where you'd evaluate it. Because remember, we're defining political violence. We're not evaluating it. We're not making a moral evaluation of it, because on the one hand, you could say, attacking Democrats or attacking Republicans based on the people they voted for should be morally condemned within a society. Within America, the right agrees with this. The left sort of does. I mean, they loosely do when it's advantageous to their position. Right, it will play with it as well. They're a little bit more strict to that principle. But the left is absolutely not strict to that principle. I think that's a major issue within the American political system, is that the left is fully willing to justify violence against its political opponents almost ad infinitum. It's really strange. So when we move forward from there, So political violence can be targeting people based on who they voted for. It could also be targeting people based on their political views. An example of political violence would be if your government is a monarchy and you go after all the people who want to turn that monarchy into a republic, that would be considered political violence. If you exist in a monarchy and you want to establish a republic, that'd be considered, and you want to use violence to accomplish it, that would be political violence. So let's move on to another subject. Remembering to separate the fact of a thing versus the evaluation of a thing. This is a statement. This is a statement of fact. This is a statement of evaluation. This is where epistemology will come into play. So the idea, so the concept that ideas can be violence, or the idea of motivating violence. So here's an example. If I tell somebody to go commit violence, and they go commit violence, am I held morally responsible? Was my action violent? Because in a sense, I'm abstract, but I'm still doing violence on whoever the target is. A example would be, you're a general, you're going to send soldiers to fight another country. Is that general committing violence? Is that politician committing violence? If I have the authority over a governing body, whether it is an agency responsible for the enforcement of laws, or a standing army with the intent of the defense of the nation, and I have the authority over them, whether by legitimate or illegitimate means, and I command them to go do violence on somebody, am I the one doing violence? Or rather, am I not doing violence, but held culpable for the violence done? That, I think, is a more appropriate a more appropriate condition, not condition, outcome. So that means, and this comes down to, it can happen on a national scale. What happens on an individual scale? If I tell my brother if I give him a weapon and I say, go shoot that person, did I do violence? Technically, no, but I should be held culpable to some extent for how that is done, because I had influence over him, but not necessarily authority, maybe. I also don't have a brother, so don't figure it out. But you get my point. I think in this subject of how we think about violence is possibly more important than most of anything else regarding its application. A really good example that comes out through this is the use of force within permitted carry self-defense. The thing that ends up really having the weight is not whether or not you can not only can you perform with the firearm. There's a joke in there somewhere. Not only can you perform with your tool, but whether or not you're doing it appropriately at its right time and place in scenario. And so, that being the case, this has been the first foray into the philosophy of violence. Recognizing it's a little confusing, I apologize. I'm working my way through this. Where we have determined that there is a separation between the act of a thing and the moral evaluation of a thing. We've established the foundation: metaphysics, ethics, epistemology, and logic. Metaphysics, what is real, what is violence? Ethics, what makes an action that is violent? Also, or you can use metaphysics, what makes an action violent? What is violence? 2, ethics, what makes a violent act or act of violence evil or good? How do we evaluate it? Epistemology, what does knowledge have to do with an act? For example, if I know that when does an act become self-defense? When do I get to claim that I knew that you were going to attack me? Because if you point a gun at me, that's pretty clear. Then I acknowledged, I recognized, I came in an understanding that you were threatening violent force against me, and I used my handgun to defend myself. But what happens if you're 6 months out? somehow I have the divine foresight to determine that you're going to point a handgun at me at 6 months. Am I then justified in self-defense to go over and attack you now? This challenges the concept of preemptive self-defense. But we'll have to get into that on another subject. And finally, logic, which is not a subject that we use to logically. We use logic we will continue to use logic, or we'll use logic in informal uses in the future. We'll delve into formal logic in the future to determine and seek out contradictions in examples and cases. That being the case, thank you for listening to this Friday's edition of the Redacted Culture Cast. This is the first delve into the philosophy of violence and how we understand it, and how we understand culture, and how we understand things, how we know what we know, and how we are moving forward. I am encouraged by your support. I want to make the announcement that we are basically 1 month into the show, and we're well over 2,005, or we're in the 2,500 downloads range. So, what that means from what I understand is that for a launch, we've had a successful launch. Thank you very much for your time. Please like and share and subscribe to the show. If you're going to subscribe, I appreciate it very much. We have live appearances Monday and Wednesday. This week coming up is Mojave Repeater and Isaac Bodkin. We talk about how to become radio ready and how the Enlightenment led to the Second Amendment, and what are the truth claims involved in the Second Amendment. This has been the philosophy of violence this has been our first foray into the philosophy of violence. I'm your host. Thank you for your support. Head over to redactedllc.com. Talk to you soon.